Welcome back. I'm really excited about this one today because I get it to do a little bit of what I do best. I always like to consider myself a purveyor of historical awesomeness. And that's what we're going to do today. We're going to get into a topic that is, really, really interesting and at least partially based in fact. There are facts involved in this story. There are some very interesting things you will see that actually occurred. There are also some things that you may have to suspend disbelief a bit. However, there are eyewitness accounts that claim this happened, and this person could be exactly what he claimed to be, and that would be Immortal. Huh. Have you ever heard of the Count Saint Germain? Well, if you haven't, you're going to today. Now, I will tell you, this is just a brief overview of the Count because there's so many stories that revolve around this guy. I can't even begin to cover every one of them. We would be doing this for hours. And nobody wants to listen to me talk for hours, I'm sure. But this one is pretty interesting. I took a deep dive on this one the other day, and when the rabbit hole opens, you have to go down this thing and discover all the wonderful information that you will find. And this one is pretty interesting, I will say. So let's get started with the Count Saint Germain and get into a little bit of the history of the man himself. So there was a guy around the turn of the century in New Orleans, the Crescent City. Imagine yourself standing on the corner of Royal Street on a Sunday afternoon and checking things out. Maybe you got a hurricane. I don't know if they would have had those at the turn of the century. But anyway, if you're in New Orleans, you're probably having a good time because New Orleans is a great town. Imagine you're down there around the turn of the century, and this is, I should mention, the turn of the 20th century. So the 1900s, where all us old people were born around in the 1900s. So you're in New Orleans, early 20th century, 1910s, somewhere in there. And there is a gentleman that is from France who shows up. He buys a house on Royal Street. He is just the talk of the town. Everybody loves this guy. He claims to descend from French aristocracy, so to speak. He just happens to look just exactly like the Count Saint Germain. They're almost identical. People will say, "Well, that's you." So no, that's my great, grandfather or something. He will say that, or great, whatever it would be at that time. The Count Saint Germain is my ancestor, and it's not me. But he looks to be about 45 years old, and he throws the best parties on Royal Street. Everybody shows up. Everybody's hanging out. They're having a great time with Jacques Saint Germain in New Orleans. Now, everything's going wonderful for this guy, and people show up to his parties. They have a good time. They drink. They eat. They carry on. There's just one thing. No one ever actually sees Saint Germain taking part in the libations himself. He's not drinking. He's not eating. People wonder, what's up with this guy? Well, anyway, eventually the fun ends when a young lady is found outside his house on Royal Street, and she is bleeding. There's blood coming from her neck area, and the police are called. People are, very, concerned about this young lady. At first, they believe maybe she was visiting Jacques Saint Germain and fell out of his house. It was like a 2-story house, and fell out and hurt herself. Well, they go in to try to go inside the house to find Jacques Saint Germain, and he's nowhere to be found. Poof, gone, like Kaiser Soze. He's gone. So where did he go? Where's he gone to? And this lady's out front, and the story she tells about the guy trying to, suck her blood, so to speak. And then they go inside the house, and they find bottles full of blood they find blood everywhere, where someone must have been consuming these. They were like wine bottles that were full of blood, and who was this guy, and what's going on. And then the legend begins, and it's the vampire of New Orleans. In fact, if you go to New Orleans and you go on a vampire tour, they will take you to the areas that Jacques Saint Germain may have frequented, right? So they'll do that. And the really interesting part about this, if you've ever seen Interview with a Vampire or read any of Anne Rice's novels on the Vampire Chronicles, there's one guy, the vampire Lestat. Well, Lestat is based on Jacques Saint Germain. She had heard the story, of course, growing up in New Orleans, and she was fascinated by it, right? This vampire of New Orleans. And she based Lestat on, on this guy, Jacques Saint Germain, who allegedly descended from the Count Saint Germain from France. Now, here's where it gets interesting. That in and of itself is a great story, right? So this guy, this unknown guy, he disappears, and they say he pops up here and there in New Orleans. You could be, kicking around today, having a beignet, and then he can pop up, maybe here and there. So I don't know. Is that true or not? Now, here's where you really go back and you start to get into it. Who was the Count Saint Germain? Well, here's the story where it gets interesting. Now, because the Count Saint Germain allegedly was immortal. Say what? Yes, he was allegedly immortal. He was a count in the 18th century. He was a count in France. His background is pretty murky. They don't really know where he came from. All they know is this guy knew everything. I mean, this guy could play music. He was a true, Renaissance man. Could play music. He could do, science. He was supposed to have understood the Philosopher's Stone, turning base metals into gold. He allegedly had figured out the elixir of life, which means he could live forever. He was immortal and this and that, and he popped up in all kinds of places, and people love this guy. In fact, Voltaire, if you've studied any history, Voltaire, the philosopher, right, is quoted as saying, Saint Germain knows everything and never dies. A very interesting thing when you start to talk about it. Many people would see Saint Germain and they would claim, I saw you 50 years ago. That must have been, you have to be very old, or, your ancestors look just like you. But as the story goes, it was him the whole time. He's always 45 years old. He always looks the same, and he is always around, this guy, right? Okay. So it's an interesting story from the start. He is, in factual basis, the Count Saint Germain was a real guy. You can find all his works and different things that he did. Fascinating cat all the way around, the Count Saint Germain, right? In fact, Louis XV got word that, Saint Germain allegedly could take all the flaws out of diamonds. And he brought him to Versailles, and according to legend, he took a diamond that was very flawed and turned it into a flawless diamond for Louis XV at Versailles. Now, again, some of these are legends, some of them are recorded in different, narratives that people have put out there. But it's a very interesting story that this guy, who has a murky background, nobody knows where he came from. Allegedly, there are older people who have seen him before. He's been in different places. He keeps popping up. And the story goes, a lot of people thought this guy is immortal. He's some kind of, magical being of some sort, right? So it gets even better. We're just hitting the surface here. So the Count Saint Germain is also mentioned in a couple of narratives. Now, some of these would have been after he died. So it's a very interesting thing. We're going to talk about his death shortly. But, all right, so Marie Antoinette, supposedly, and this one is fascinating to me, right? So Marie Antoinette actually mentions the Count Saint Germain in her memoir. Now, there's a question whether or not it was Marie Antoinette that actually wrote this, or if it was one of the people that was serving her, one of her servants that was doing the writing, or, we're not 100% sure about that. But the Count Saint Germain is mentioned in her memoirs several times. Now, what's fascinating about it, allegedly, he told Marie Antoinette and her husband Louis XVI that they need to watch out because there's some bad stuff coming, and there's a revolution, and y'all are in trouble, right? So she writes in her memoirs when she's in jail waiting to get her, the guillotine, right? She writes, well, I should have listened to Saint Germain. That's in her memoirs, which is fascinating, right? Should have listened to Saint Germain. Now, Saint Germain allegedly was at the Bastille. He's hanging out in all these places. But that I find very interesting that she mentioned this guy, Saint Germain. Also, there's a story, which I love this story, and it gets into the area of history that I like to teach. Early America is kind of my jam, so to speak. I really love early American history. There is a story about what is referred to as the unknown patriot, right? So, and this is a prevalent story. You can find it. You can find stories about this. Even Thomas Jefferson's Monticello, the website, has a mention of this, and it goes something like this. So, during the arguing for independence, the colonies are arguing to break away from Great Britain, right? To break away from England. So they are, arguing about independence because some wanted independence, some didn't. Some wanted to stay loyal to the crown, going back and forth. And as the story goes, there was an unknown person that popped up in the back of the room and gave a impassioned speech about independence and said, you really need to do this, for yada, 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 whatever reasons. Nobody knows exactly what was said or if it even really was said. But this person allegedly popped up, said these things, and motivated everyone in the room to say, all right, let's do it. And we declare independence, right? It's a great story. But there's not a lot of, verification about this. Now, it was alleged that Thomas Jefferson had mentioned things about it and wrote about it. It's hard to find evidence of that. There's a lot of times there are things that are attributed to Jefferson and some of the other founders that aren't legitimate. I mean, quotes and things. But it's a great story, right? So, it's interesting. Allegedly, according to a guy named Manly P. Hall, now Manly P. Hall was an odd fella. He wrote a story about this event, this unknown patriot. And he said it was the Count Saint Germain that was there, right? Of course, there's no way this could be true, right? Because the guy would have been dead. So it's a very interesting thing when all this is happening. So anyway, all these things are attributed to the Count Saint Germain, right? So you have this whole narrative behind this guy being in all these historical events. And another thing I should mention, that one of the things that people said when they were around Saint Germain, they said he spoke about history like he was there. When he gave narratives of historical events, it was like he was present. He even claimed, allegedly, that he was present at the crucifixion of Jesus Christ. Okay, and that's going to come into play a little bit later. All right, so all this is going on. People sort of pick up this story. Now, Germain, he is one of these guys. Once he passes away, it doesn't mean that he dies of pneumonia, right? And there is there is stories that you can find these in the record, in the historical record, where he had passed away. He was a real person, so that he had passed away. Well, a lot of people decided that they want to look into this a little bit further, maybe even base an entire religion on this guy. There is a lady named Helena Blavatsky, which you may have heard of. There's this thing called Theosophy, which it teaches that there's an ancient and secretive brotherhood of spiritual people known as the Masters. And allegedly, Saint Germain was one of these Masters. Jesus Christ is another one of the Masters that Blavatsky will put out there, right? So interesting. They think that Saint Germain is literally one of these masters, so which would explain how he's popping up in history so many times, and talking to people and influencing historical events, right? So that's very interesting. So there was another group. They were called the I Am group, and there was a Guy and Edna Ballard was the name of the couple that founded this. Now they were inspired by Blavatsky, but it was sort of an offshoot of the Theosophy, right? Now, he claimed that he actually talked to Saint Germain when he was hiking on Mount Shasta, and Saint Germain actually inspired him to start this whole thing. And you can go right now. There is a Saint Germain movement that is headquartered in Schaumburg, Illinois. Of course, if you're going to have a place like this, it's got to be in a place called Schaumburg, Illinois. It's a suburb of Chicago, if you're curious. And that's where you can, go and talk to people about old Saint Germain and, worship him, I guess. Something along those lines, at least. So it's a very interesting thing. This guy pops up as almost a deity figure in these religions, right? He is an ascended master, allegedly, which is really interesting, right? All right, so it gets in now. How is all this even possible? I mean, how are we even getting to this point? How could this guy be what he is purported to be? We're going to get to that. Now, there's one more thing I want to mention that is fascinating to me. You may or may not have heard of a guy named Franz Mesmer. Well, Franz Mesmer, he came up with a way to basically, it bears his name, mesmerize people, which is also a form of hypnosis, right? So he worked with Saint Germain, right? He worked with him, and they came up with this way of hypnotizing people and mesmerizing. Franz Mesmer, right? It's this whole idea of animal magnetism, mesmerism, which he used for healing and different things along those lines. And he spoke with Saint Germain, who was even in this time frame, he was purported to be immortal and some kind of, magical being or some sort. I don't know. And you can find all this stuff. I mean, Franz Mesmer actually worked with him. They were contemporaries, and he helped with this whole hypnosis. So if you get hypnotized today, it has a connection to Saint Germain in a way. Now, Saint Germain does die in 1784. So some of the events he's alleged to have been at, he couldn't have been because he was dead. He died of pneumonia. Or does he? Because he keeps popping up everywhere. I mean, he pops up, like I mentioned earlier, in New Orleans. He pops up, in different places around the world. People seem to know who he is, and he always is 45. He always looks the same. Very interesting. But then as soon as he shows up, he's gone like Kaiser Soze. He's out, right? So, now, how do you explain all this, right? Now, how is this going to be, how can you look at this and say, you know what, I believe this. This makes a lot of sense to me. Because you have to suspend disbelief to think that this guy is literally immortal. You can point to, okay, there is a historical, person, the Count Saint Germain. We can look at that. We can look at his works. We can see how, special the guy was. He was really smart, a definite Renaissance man, did a lot of really cool stuff. We can see all of that, right? It's not hard to find those things. But how do you make the leap that he's like immortal? Well, there's an interesting story that some people will they conflate with Saint Germain. And this one is great. I absolutely love this. Now, this is one of those likely apocryphal stories. If you don't know what that is, those are the kind of stories that pop up that aren't true. People will say they're apocryphal, like George Washington chopping down the cherry tree. That's one. That never happened. That was Parson Weems wrote a story of George Washington, and a lot of the things like he can never tell a lie, chop down the cherry tree, and all that stuff. That's all, apocryphal stories about the United States or the founding generation, things like that. There's a lot of those, right? Also, there's what's referred to as an apocrypha, where it's the books or the stories that didn't make it in the Bible, right? That didn't make it in the canonized version. So when you pick up the King James Bible today and the stories that you have that are in there, or the books of the Bible, there's some that didn't make it in, right? Now, here's one of those stories. Now, this one comes up later, and I can't even say that it was even a story during the time of Christ or shortly thereafter when you had a lot of these religious texts that popped up, because you don't see it, but you do see it later on, and it's referred to as the story of the wandering Jew. Now, what is that? Well, here's how it goes. So the story goes that there was this person that during the crucifixion, as Jesus is carrying the cross, right, and he falls, there's a moment, I think Simon of Cyrene, correct me if I'm wrong, but I believe that's right, helps him back up or carries the cross for him. And this was one of those, around that time when he allegedly fell with the cross, right? And there was this person who stepped up and said, you should, and he kind of makes fun of Jesus. He says, you should pick that up and keep going. Don't stop. You can't stop, right? You can't rest here. You must keep going. And sort of being like mean and allegedly Jesus says, well, you will never rest until I come again. Now, the story goes that they make the jump that Saint Germain is the wandering Jew. Now, what do I mean by that? Well, according to the story, that when he says you won't rest until I return, that means he's not going to die. He will be basically immortal forever and walk the earth. And he's referred to as the wandering Jew because he was a Jewish person. Now, this is, of course, you really have to suspend disbelief on this one, but people have pointed to the Count Saint Germain being immortal. It totally makes sense. He's the wandering Jew. In fact, he even mentions in some of his stories that he was a contemporary of Jesus Christ and knew him and actually was at the crucifixion. That makes sense then, doesn't it, right? So that must be where this whole thing come from. Because he pops up over and over again throughout history. And he speaks about history like he was there. Very interesting stuff. Because he knows his history. That's one thing we do know about Saint Germain, is he was, amongst other things, a pretty accomplished historian. So there you go. Was he the wandering Jew? Was he something else entirely? We don't really know, but it is a very interesting story and kind of fun to go down the rabbit hole on this thing. So you could be today, right? You could go to New Orleans, have you a couple hurricanes at Pat O'Brien's, cruise around Bourbon Street, walk through the quarter, and run across a guy who's 45 years old and come up and talk to you and tell you a few stories. And, maybe he's a vampire. Maybe he's the wandering Jew. Maybe he's the immortal alchemist, Saint Germain, the Count Saint Germain. You don't know. It's possible. It's a very interesting story. And this is the kind of stuff that you just have to say is a lot of fun. And I have to, as we're talking about this and we're looking at it, New Orleans has so much history. And New Orleans is such a great town. There's really, you can find so many cool things in New Orleans. And I hope that, if nothing else, this very short, and I have to say there's so many other stories. This guy allegedly could turn himself invisible and could, shape shift. There's so many crazy stories that are wrapped up with this Count Saint Germain guy. That you can find them. If you want to know more, look them up. And there's a lot of podcasts out there, a lot of different people that talk about this in depth. But this is just a sort of a introduction, like an appetizer to great history. But go to New Orleans, check it out. Enjoy. Maybe you'll run into the Count Saint Germain down in the quarter. Who knows? But that is today's podcast, and I hope you enjoyed it. And we'll do more of these little historical things going forward. So have a great day.